Okay, everybody, I'd like to thank you for participating in the RAC conference. We're doing this session here on the Canadian Forces Affiliated Radio System, the presentation being done by Phil McBride. He was licensed in 1994 and is now an advanced NCW certificate holder. He is currently serving as the Ontario South Director for the Radio Amateurs of Canada, and as well as the training officer for the Canadian Forces Affiliate Radio System. Phil is also a contact scouter for the 1st Acton Scout Group, where he owns and sponsors the VE3 NEC Memorial Amateur Radio Station at the Acton Scout House, a permanent HF, UHF installation used by all Scout members across Canada. He is an ISEDC Accredited Examiner and has given dozens of new radio amateurs their exams via telepresence during this COVID-19 pandemic. And Phil has also done quite a bit of DXing in his time, and he's well known to a lot of you here that are probably present today. So without further ado, Phil, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, we'll let you basically have the floor, and then you can take over the screen.
All right, thanks, Paul. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Phil, VA3QR, and my CFARS call sign, for those who don't know, is CIW 601. I am the training officer for the Canadian Forces Affiliate Radio System. Some of you here know what that is already because you're already members, and some of you probably have no idea what it is. So let's hop into it now, and I'll show you all about it. All right. What is CFARS? Similar to MARS, CFARS is a program sponsored by 7Com Group and the Canadian Joint Operations Command, in which military installations, unit club and volunteer licensed amateur radio stations and operators, and known as affiliates, participate and contribute to the aim of providing auxiliary communications on a local, national, and or international basis as an adjunct to existing military communications. So before we get into what CFARS is today, let's get into a little bit of what CFARS was. A lot of us here know the history of amateur radio and the suspension of the service in World War II. Possibly the first close association between amateur radio and the military in this country occurred during World War II, at which time the call to arms saw many of the electronics and communicator trade positions in all three of the armed services filled by amateur radio operators, and many of these amateurs formed the nucleus of the Canadian Forces Communications training cadre. And it is a well-documented fact that the experience and expertise of those operators contributed greatly to an effective communication system. I've been told stories from people who are many years my senior when I got licensed, which was in the mid-90s, about the radio inspector coming to your door and taking your finals away when they suspended the amateur service. And they usually sent a recruiting officer with that radio inspector to convince you to either join up and enlist, or if you didn't want to join up, to stay a civilian and to help the war effort by training the signals operators, known as Jimmies, who were going to be operating in the air, at sea, or on the field overseas. On August 8th, 1946, the Air Force Amateur Radio System was implemented. It operated for 6 years until August of '52, at which time a portion of the program was integrated into the Civil Defense Communications Organization. It was made up of about 500 licensed ham radio operators from across the country and carried out such roles as providing communication in the area of search and rescue, assistance during national emergencies, and operating a weekly net and regional nets, operating weekly nets on a regional and national basis. It was funded by the Department of National Defense and operated on various frequencies allocated just outside the amateur bands. It published a great quarterly magazine and provided various types of communications equipment on a loan basis to the members. So going forward, The early evolution of CFARS, the organization successfully provided telephone patch services to DND to allow deployed service members to talk back home to their families. If you want to think about the time that this technology in this group was active, there was no such thing as a sat phone. There was no such thing as satellite. It was necessary to use two-way radio to provide phone patch services back home. And to do that commercially was very costly, so members just took it upon themselves to provide that service to the stations licensed overseas. It built a network of licensed amateur radio operators within the forces, which were familiar with native communications protocols, which are different from amateur protocols. And we'll go over that in a short while. Over time, it became difficult to find military members who held their amateur radio credentials, which slowed the flow of traffic. And because phone patch traffic was being handled within the amateur bands, primarily, deliberate interference became a problem. So, out of that came the creation of CFARS. DND determined the partnership with the amateur radio community was worthwhile, so National Defense Headquarters launched the creation of the Canadian Forces Affiliate Radio System. It was generally agreed that the long-range outlook would be to provide a traffic and phone patch service for the forces personnel wherever they were located, whether at sea, the far north, peacekeeping operations, and other locations where the number of service personnel would warrant the deployment of such equipment. CFARS was organized in a fashion similar to US Mars, which has been operating at that point for about 50 years. Now, while the amount of traffic that we would handle wouldn't compare to the States, the operational principles were sound and they were shared. So the concept is that the members would operate on specifically allocated frequencies just outside the amateur spectrum. And just outside meant usually just above or just below the bands that we traditionally use, which means that we wouldn't have to go cut new antennas. Most of our antennas are broadbanded enough that even the directionals would be able to operate on these specific frequencies, but because they're outside of the amateur spectrum, you wouldn't have to worry about deliberate QRM. We provide membership to include military installation stations, military amateur radio and club stations, and a number of designated volunteer affiliated licensed amateur radio operators. That would be someone who's just operating from home. Operating using quasi-military voice and operating procedures, the NATO Allied Communication Protocol, for example, ACP 125, 126, and 127. And they operate on several different radio nets actually held by the military units, for example, the Northern Net, HMCS, the UN Canadian contingents, et cetera, and use international call signs while operating within its own framework. The regulator approved this. Trials were performed in the spring of '78 on a frequency just below 20 meters. And participants included military amateur stations at Ismailia and the Golan Heights in the Middle East, and 13 amateur stations in Canada. And the selection of the stations in Canada was made on the advice received from the Ismailia station. Temporary calls were issued. The trials were conclusively successful, the traffic volume having increased dramatically above that normally handled within the hand bands. Worthy of note, the tests had previously been carried out by what is now known today as ISEDC on similar equipment that was used by the Ismailia station during the trials, had already shown that frequency tolerances and stability were well within those allowed by the regs. If you want to consider the equipment at the time, we're used to now with our equipment operating from 1 through 30 without any problems. If you think about the equipment at the time, tolerances were much, it was a much bigger problem. There were technical challenges that had to be overcome that we don't have to go through today. Prior to '78, the two base amateur radio clubs, one in Lahr and one in Baden, Sullivan, were unable to participate in phone patching message sending that was taking place in Cyprus and the Middle East. Because Canada had no third-party agreements with Germany, and although we were Canadians, we were required to use German calls and follow domestic regulations. After '78, the two aforementioned clubs were provided with CFARS call signs, and when that occurred, they immediately began getting lineups for phone patching. Fortunately, we had enough operators to work every day, night of the week, and on weekends. The hardest part was when the brigade was away on fall concentrations, taking over half the hands with them. But as soon as those stations got call signs, the traffic open, the floodgates open, and traffic began to pass. And that occurred until 92 and 93. And then in the latter days, separate schedules were arranged with several Eastern or Western Canadian stations to service Lar and Baden only, allowing the Middle East to pass more uninterrupted traffic at other frequencies. And two of the mainstays in Canada were Vince Williams, CIW 605 in Navan, Ontario, and Vic Williams, CIW 202 in Armstrong, BC, the two brothers who enjoyed their hobby and gave their time to provide service for the troops. During the first Gulf War, CFARS set up a station in the state of Qatar. Arrangements were made at CFB LAR through the Chief Communications Officer, who at the time was Chief Warrant Officer Frank Hughes, who was instrumental in getting equipment sent into theater. And the station operated from January 91 until March 91, completing hundreds of phone patches, messages, and flower orders to Canadian loved ones, as well as thousands of amateur contacts with the three operators in theater: Darcy Benz, CW 311, Gary Stewart, CW 313, and Bill Hicks, CW 320. It should be noted that 311 and 320 are still active. Now, as time goes on, of course, phone patches became less and less relevant with the penetration of satellite communications, and then after that, with cellular and internet-based telephony and video conferencing, the practice of phone patches has completely stopped. Due to changes in base regulations, the number of on-base amateur radio clubs began to decrease until there were eventually none left. This, amongst other things, led to fewer and fewer amateur radio operators within the forces itself. Now, that said, HF radio has been identified as a tertiary but vital means of long-distance communications. If you want to talk about the ability to communicate over long distance with as little infrastructure as possible, with relatively low power. You can consider a 100-watt station is 20 amps to 12 volts. This is not hard to find even in an emergency. And it should also be noted that in 2014, the Department of National Defense contracted Harris to replace the entire repository of the HF equipment within the Canadian Forces. And the newer equipment they're basically this big, and they're basically exciters. They are fully software defined, on-the-fly encryption, and they will fit into any of the current man packs. So the 20-watt man packs, the 150-watt mobile device, a 400-watt, they call it a QRT, a quick readiness terminal, which is what you would find under the mesh tent when it's deployed, or the big 10,000-watt amplifiers at CFB Kingston or CFB Edmonton. Now, although newer commercial and military HF radio rely on automatic link establishment for connection of circuit, knowledge of HF radio principles is vital to smooth operation. We all know this is hams. ALE, for those of you who don't know, is a system in which the radios talk to each other every 60 minutes to determine who can hear what on what assignment. And it's great until the ionosphere flips over and within 50 minutes, all the bands change. We know as hams how this works, but DND does not have this knowledge base. So the current raison d'etre is to add flexibility and depth to the present military communication systems, provide a pool of trained communicators for continuity, provide an emergency communications and public service capability in the event of the forces and or in civil power, age of civil power, and provide training on HF radio to the regular and reserve forces. There are three types of stations within CFARS still to this day: military stations, regular and reserve force operators using DND-owned equipment and facilities. For example, the Communications Electronics Museum in Kingston would be considered a military station. A military unit or a club amateur station, of which none exist right now, and I'll get to that in a second, located on Canadian Forces bases using a mixture of public and non-public funding. And the more popular, the affiliate stations. For example, me, volunteer amateur radio operators using privately owned equipment and facilities. And it should be of note that many, but not all of these are retired members of the forces, RCMP, and the other emergency services. Like I said, a lot of them, but not all of them. The requirements to be an affiliate station: you must have HF privileges. So basic with honors or basic plus code is a must. Authority to operate high power is preferred, so there is definitely a preference for advanced operators. You must have a station capable of HF radio telephone and digital communications. You must have antennas capable of operating on the designated frequency assignments. Now, like I said, these assignments, while not published, are just outside of the traditional amateur bands. Your station must be kept in a state of emergency readiness, and declaring your ability to operate without commercial power is definitely preferred. Members must be prepared and willing to modify or have their equipment modified to operate outside the traditional bands. For those who want to take their equipment to a retailer to have it done, you would be provided with paperwork to prove to those retailers that you are legally allowed to do this. You must familiarize yourself with the appropriate operational procedures. Operating in the military service is a lot different than operating in the amateur service. There are documents that are specific to that you will be given, and we hold that in order, and training sessions in order to help you familiarize yourself with those procedures versus the amateur service. You must regularly check into scheduled nets and attend as many on-air training exercises as you are able. So, CFARS is officially affiliated with the Department of National Defense through the Department of Frequency Spectrum Management, the 7th Communications Group, and the Canadian Joint Ops Command. We do have an affiliation with the RCP National Operations Center, as well as Public Safety Canada through the Government Operations Center, as well as Transport Canada Security and Emergency Services. We do also have a relationship with the U.S. Department of Defense through the Military Auxiliary Radio Service in the United States. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. This map is a couple of years old, but I don't think it's, we are missing some stations that aren't there anymore. There are between 100 and 150 affiliate radio stations across the country. You will see that, where they are, the bulk of the stations are distributed where you would expect them, where the population in Canada exists. CFARS HF frequencies, we have the use of 26 DND authorized frequencies between 2 and 30 megs close to the traditional ham bands. Of those, 9 frequencies are approved for cross-border communications with Mars and the United States Department of Defense. We do regularly communicate with Mars, and we do regularly participate in exercises where US DoD stations are a part. During these exercises, during other exercises that we'll talk about in a second, there may be other frequency assignments that we are used, and those are assigned by the Department of Frequency Spectrum Management and the Chief Communications Officer is required. So there will be times when we do an exercise where they say, here are 50 HF frequency assignments, program your radio, and you basically have temporary access to those frequencies. And you'll use some weird assignments that you might have to do some interesting antenna tuning for. It gets interesting. The capabilities, the basic capability is single sideband radio telephone using ACP 125 procedures. Connectivity by automatic link establishment when required. There is software out there that you can use to turn your radio into an ALE radio, which will let you connect to other, what we call green radios. If you program it properly, you can actually establish a circuit with a Harris radio and talk to a soldier on the other end. By the same token, we use a piece of software that allows us to imitate the 188, 110A NATO waveform, which is gets you between 75 and 4,800 bits per second on a 3 kilohertz wide channel, which is interoperable with NATO HF radio equipment. A more common one would be the Harris TAC-Chat board. We do use RMS WinLink equipment. We do, which is not interoperable with the military. But there's something to be said for being able to talk to military equipment and be able to talk to a soldier or talk to a reserve unit. There's also something to be said about getting the message out no matter what. So there are several WinLink remote message stations on CFARS assignments that are outside of the amateur band. And those are the quick deploy message gateways. We can, although it is not used very often, we are able to use other amateur digital modes as fallback. And if we ever have to go back there, it's probably a bad day, but it is possible. All digital communications are done using ACP 127 procedures, so it doesn't matter what mode you're using. You follow the rules set forth in the Allied Communication Protocol. One of the great capabilities of CFARS is situational awareness. So you have enough of us spread out around the country, and something happens in the East Coast. Well, someone in the East Coast can then get that information out to the rest of the country pretty quickly. Because if something happens in the East Coast, and all of us know what's going on, all of us, have instructions to tune into a frequency and start a net, and then someone on the East Coast hops on that net and is able to communicate that information. The same way as you would on amateur radio. Going back to what I first said at the beginning of this presentation about the communications experience of amateur radio operators during the Second World War, nothing has changed. You got to get enough people, enough members of this organization who are seasoned communicators, who have spent a lot of time on amateur radio, whether contesting, whether DXing, whether doing emergency communications itself. That expertise stacks up, and it provides a great knowledge base for D&D to draw on if needed. All of this together creates a national 24/7 HF backbone in the event of something going horribly wrong. So, CFARS and domestic operations, or DOMOPs, are a natural fit. Called upon, the Canadian Forces provides military aid to civilian authorities in time of crisis. If there is ever an emergency that is intra-provincial, that will probably be the Minister of Public Safety walking over to the Minister of National Defense and asking for help. It builds partnerships with other government organizations to coordinate assistance and respond effectively to hazardous situations and plan for major emergencies and or natural disasters. If activated, CFARS is able to provide a national HF communications capability independent from or in conjunction with the forces. So we can either operate our own nets, or we can use our military authorization to communicate with an established net within the forces itself. There are exercises that occur yearly. One of the big ones is hosted by the Canadian Forces, because it's called Exercise Noble Skywave. It happens every October. It's hosted by the Communications Electronics Branch at CFB Kingston. The participants are from the Five Eyes military, traditionally. More recently, over the past couple of years, they've opened up participation from other NATO allies. The civilian auxiliaries, which include CFARS and Mars, have been invited and are invited to participate, and I have participated on several occasions. This exercise lasts 48 hours, and it's radio, telephone, and digital. You can either operate sideband only, you can use ALE, and you can choose or choose not to use digital modes, for example. This is just one exercise. There are others that are put on yearly, and there are others that just show up out of nowhere. And this is just a scan of a letter that I received in the mail, addressed from the Department of National, from DND, which freaked my wife out when I got it. She's like, "Why do you have a letter from DND in the mailbox?" And it was from a team, a Canadian Forces team that was operating Noble Skywave in 2018 from Norway, and I was their last contact in the dying seconds of the exercise that let them go over the top and win the exercise. So, it was kind of fun to get that letter in the mail and to freak my wife out. That's always fun. So, operating then versus operating now. So that's my presentation. I'm going to add a couple of things before I open up to questions. It should be noted that some developments that have occurred as a result of COVID. There is another presentation going on right now, which Matt Batten, or I should say Lieutenant Matt Batten, VE3ZQW, has worked very hard to encourage a number of youth to get involved in amateur radio, and his youth specifically are Sea Cadets in the Trenton area, in West Quinte, and that exercise has actually led to a number of other military groups, cadet groups, becoming interested in amateur radio. And his group is actually in the process of building a station that is eventually going to request a CFARS club call sign, probably the only one that will be active in the country, because it will be considered an amateur radio club on DND property. They've got antennas up, and they're planning to operate in Noble Skywave and QRPX, which is a US sponsored contest that they put on. So that's happening. So there's going to be an opportunity where CFARS can not only help train the reserve and the regular forces in the use of HF radio, but maybe actually help some of the cadets coming up. In this case, it's mainly naval cadets, but there's also talk about getting Signals Army cadets involved. There are 1,200 of those just in Ontario attached to the 32nd. So that's something else that's happening. That's an up and coming thing that's still being worked out, but that's kind of what's going on. So that's my presentation, and I'd be happy to open up to questions.
A question for you, Phil.
Yes, sir.
John, VE7 Romeo Bravo out in BC. I've got several radios that I use and whatnot. When you're making an application to become a member of CFARS, do you have to transfer over all your radios to be open out of the amateur bands, or can you have a dedicated radio to do that?
That would be entirely up to you. You'd have to have at least one, but that would be up to you. And I've heard that before. So people have asked, do I do them all? Do I do one of them? I've done them all. So every station I have, I've opened up, and I've had opened up by the manufacturers, or either by the manufacturer, in my case Flex, or by the retailer, by Radio World, if I buy new radio. So again, completely up to you. You've got to have at least one.
Right, and we bear the cost for doing that.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks for the question.
Bill.
Yes, sir.
What's the next step if I'm interested in going further with this?
If you're interested in becoming a member of CFARS, I guess I should have mentioned this. If you go to cfarsoperations.ca, in fact, give me a second, if you go to that website in the chat, and you can download an application, fill it out, and you'll send it to the CCO. The email address is on the website and on the form, and your application will be discussed, and it will be approved or not. Approval is not a guaranteed thing. There are a limited number of stations which we are allowed to have. There are a limited number of call signs, and we also try to make sure that we keep separation. Now, you're a VE9, so I don't think that's going to be too much of a problem, versus a place like Ontario, where there's a concentration. If you are interested, I absolutely encourage you to apply.
Did you bring up something that we should look at for?
I put it in the chat, but if you want to just go to www.cfarsoperations.ca. But I have put that in the, that's my fault. I sent it direct to Paul. There you go. Now it's public in the chat.
It's in the chat. Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
No problem. Anyone else?
Yeah, I've got my hand up.
Oh, hey, John, go ahead.
No problem. The question is, I'm apartment bound. I do my HF operating mobile or static mobile, and I'm developing the station, but I can get on 20, 40, 80, pretty much most of the stuff there. And I'm doing VHF roving and stuff as well. But how much of a station does one need?
Well, that's an interesting question. And that's a question I'm not sure I can answer for you. So what I would recommend you do, if you'd like an answer to that question, if you go to the CFARS website and you look up the CCO, the Chief Communications Officer's email, and you send that to him, that would be the person who would best be able to answer that question for you.
Thank you.
No problem. Are there any other questions, or are there any other members of CFARS who would like to add, or maybe take issue with something I've said? Because I can already tell there are several people here who have been around a lot longer than I have, who might have something to say.
Why, VE3JJA CIW 610. Bill, Just want to say that, John, just want to say it's a rewarding organization. We provide a role for the Canadian population. Phil, you do a great job in what you do. Thanks for your presentation. And I'm happy to be associated with all the members of CFARS. Thanks, Phil.
Thanks, buddy. Jerry, I saw you wave your hand again.
Yes, Phil, are you available for additional training, like one-on-one?
Yeah. So as a training officer, either I design a training program or I facilitate something that's already happening. If any members of CFARS have questions or they're getting stuck on something, you email me. I help you work through it. The most recent exercise we had, we actually did a GoToMeeting session beforehand, which was the first time we'd ever done that, and it was very well received. That will probably continue. That'll happen again as we do it. So, yes, I am available. Yeah, but if you become part of CFARS, then yes, I am available for that. And you know what? So is everyone else. We've begun doing more regional nets as well. There's a central net, there's a western net. We paused the Eastern net for the summer, but we're coming out of summer now. So I should say Eastern net. We're talking Ontario. I'd like there for it to be an actual Eastern net, but that would be something that kind of situation would help with training as well.
Very good, thank you.
All right. Mitch?
So someone was asking about what it takes to get a radio modified. Most of the modern radios are pretty easy to modify these days. It's really a simple matter of removing a diode or adding a diode. 95% of the times it's removing a diode. I know you can get the manufacturers, you can get ICOM to do it. They've had a few requests to do it. I know when that happens, they often send me a note saying, is this fellow really a CFARS member? And I send them back a note saying yes or no. And if it's yes, then they'll modify it. They don't charge very much to do it. It's probably a half hour, 10 minutes. So it's pretty easy to do. And I've modified every radio I have. It's not difficult at all to do. Just like I say, it's a simple matter of generally removing a diode.
Exactly. I've got my Flex 5000. I've got a TS5. I got a 590 behind me. I've got a 480 in the truck. I've got a 991 in my one kit. I got a 705 in my other kit. They're all modified open. I did two of them myself. One got done by Radio World, and for those of you in Eastern Canada, you probably know Ronnie VE3 NLS. He did the rest because Radio World is no longer doing anything on site. They farm everything off to him, and he's very familiar with it. In fact, he's actually applying to become a member of CFARS. So there's a resource there if you don't want to do it yourself. But Mitch is right. It's not it's small. If you're steady with a soldering iron and you've got a good eye, you're probably okay.
So I'll add one thing. If you do a search on the internet for Mars CFARS mod, you will find lots of information, including pictures on what has to be done. I'll just let you know, I don't think I've ever touched a radio with a soldering iron to do the modification. I usually take an X-Acto knife and I lift the diode off, or I take a small pair of tweezers and I crush it. If it's not my radio, I will lift it off and then I'll take the diode back inside so it can be unmodified if it has to be in the future.
Phil, have there been many people with IC 7300s who have joined CFARS and had to do the modifications?
Yes, I have seen the 7300 modded. It's not that big of a deal.
I have one too, CIW 610 modified 7300.
CE3 KKA.
Victor Echo 3, Juliet Alpha, Northwest Ontario on the Manitoba border.
Okay, thanks, Woody.
You're welcome.
John again.
Oh, hi, thank you. What range or average time commitment would there be on some period? Whether it's any way you want to state it, whether it's a year, monthly, quarterly, it's fine.
You join, and if you, your participation over a period of a year will be kept an eye on. So your participation in the nets, there is a national net every Sunday at 2200 Zulu. and it should be mentioned that's 2200 Zulu. That does not change with daylight savings time. And your participation on net is monitored. Participation in the regional nets is monitored. So if you join and they find out that you haven't shown up in a net in a year, you're going to get an email, because again, there are a finite number of call signs and there are a finite number of users that are able to be active. So yeah, so after about a year, you'll if you're not participating, someone will come and see what's going on, for example. Anyone else?
George Doer, Victor Yankee 2 Golf Foxtrot and PEI.
Hi, George. How you doing?
I'm doing relatively well. I've enjoyed your presentation, and I was wondering, the CFARS have any kind of a program to reach out to the various veterans group? I can think of two here in Prince Edward Island, and I'm always sending them information about rack courses and things like that, and I don't know if I'm having any success or not.
No, I don't think there's anything that's been done before. It's an interesting concept and something that, something that I might consider bringing up with the national manager. I'm not entirely sure if we have the resources to be able to do that. But that is an idea. However, just being, and the veterans groups, and that's great. And if they're former Jimmies themselves, so they have signals experience, that's great. But they also need access to a station. That is a fairly, it is a requirement. If you're going to be a CFARS member, you have to be equipped, whether that's your equipment or whether it's a club station, or if you're a military station. Military station is just you got a CFARS call sign, but you're your D&D facility, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look. Thanks for the presentation. It was quite enlightening.
I appreciate it. Glad this for me started a few years ago when I was curious. There's bars in the States, but don't we have something like that here? And I Googled for 30 seconds. I went, oh wait, we do. And I'd been a ham at that point for 20 years, and I had never known about it. So it caught me by surprise. So I like to make sure that other people know about it too.
Thanks.
Anything else? All right. Well, with that, thank you very much. I appreciate your attention, and thank you very much. I hope you have a great day.
I appreciate your presentation there, Phil. A lot of good questions, and it's interesting that there are quite a few CFARS stations across Canada, but always, like you say, interested to get more out, amateur operators involved in the program. So I appreciate your putting together the presentation for us, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having 7-3.